Hey friends, Heath Home here. Welcome back to the channel. Do you sometimes find the sheer number of audio effects in Ableton Live and the possibilities of what they can do a little overwhelming? I mean, what exactly is each one designed to do, and how might we best use them? What are the benefits of learning them inside out? Will we become better at audio effects programming? Like, is that going to help our music stand out from the crowds? Well, the goal of today's video is to help you find out. So stick around and learn more about Ableton Live's audio effects and how best to use them. So without further ado, let's dive into today's live stream. First of all, I will just say a very quick shout out to Lauren. Thank you for your nice comment that's already left there in the chat. Understood you couldn't join the stream today, but you'll be watching back on replay. Okay, so first comes first. Recently, I've just noticed the webcam's a little bit wonky there. Let's just see if we can reset that. Give me a second. Right, that looks a little bit better. Okay, so first things first, recently I created a free PDF basically outlining some of Ableton Live's audio effects. Let's flick over to that for a quick look. Basically, there's a lot of confusion from time to time about, Ableton's Live's audio effects and what they can do. So I've created this PDF here with some little sections and then added the names of each effects underneath those sections. By no means is this absolutely 100% in the sense that there are some overlaps. So some of these could be in more than one category. So I just wanted to put that out there. I'll link this PDF in the description. It's a free download. If you fancy popping it on your desktop and looking at it as a reference as you go, then by all means be my guest. I will drop a link in the description of today's video down below. All right, so over to Ableton's world. Let's jump back over there and let's get started. So I'm just going to clean up my desktop a little bit. So hopefully you're now looking the same as me at Ableton Live. Well, sort of, I'm breaking slightly the protocol today with having some things already here, but I just thought that would be a little bit faster as we're not looking at composing MIDI and instruments and things like that. Today we're trying to get stuck into understanding what these audio effects do and how we can use them to create our own unique, distinct sounds. And I would argue that outside of learning how to program your own instruments, some synthesis, obviously getting good at things like music theory and playing in elements, programming audio effects and understanding what they do can really make a very big difference to how dramatic, how interesting the sounds in your project are. So what I've got here is just a simple few bits and pieces. We're going to walk through them in a moment. Let's just do a sound test to kick off with. Hopefully, if we've got anybody already in the stream and they're listening, if they could just drop a quick comment in there to let me know that the mic levels are okay and also the music levels, that would be amazing and much appreciated. So let's walk through what we've got here. If you felt that that sounded okay, but not particularly well, there would be a reason behind that, because literally I've tried, as I said, to keep everything very basic here to start with. So on the very first track, we've got Ableton's little drum synth kick instrument, just playing back a very simple 4 on the floor kick pattern. Okay, alongside it, we've got a clap sample. This sample, by the way, is coming from Ableton Live's packs. So it's not something that I'm showing here from my own sample library. So you would be, if you fancy this clap, you would be able to access that clap. I've then got a hi-hat track here with, again, the drum synth of Ableton Live. In this case, it's the hi-hat one. Again, I'll explain what's going on here later as we take a look at it. But again, the pattern's very simple. It's just a simple offbeat hi-hat, as is the clap, is a very simple clap pattern with literally just on the 2 and the 4 and some velocity. Over to the bass track, what we have on there is an analog at this moment in time. And we've got just, again, a very simple bass pattern playing on the E, 1 note only. Then on a melody track, we've got an instance of wavetable, which is currently in a sine wave, and 4 notes at this point in time. Over on the track that's called sustain, we've got some nice looking chords here. Okay, so more sustain material, and that is currently meld, but again, just in its default stock position, straight out the box, no sound design done. And then finally over here, we've got an audio track, which at the moment, those were all MIDI, by the way, and this one is hosting some percussion loops. And again, all of these percussion loops you can find inside of the Ableton Live packs. So you would be able to track these down. They're all coming from built-in Suite material that comes with Suite. So that's the idea behind here. We've got a few variations of the MIDI, so some other melodies we can try out in a little bit. I've also thrown in Eric Prydz' piano chords. I'm not sure if you know that track, but perhaps some of you will be very familiar with that, just for a bit of fun, and some other sustained chords here, but we'll try and keep it in key because that's going to make life a little bit easier for us to do the work we're going to do. So if in the beginning you thought it sounded a bit vanilla, well, that's the reason that it kind of does, but it doesn't sound bad, right? But it's very stock. So what I'm going to sort of say, what I might allow myself to do here is adjust things like the amp envelope inside the synthesizer, just so we can decide if we want plucky or more sort of open, sustained sounds. But apart from that, I'm going to keep the waveforms simple, as I said, and the synths very simple. So we might do a little adjustment of the amp envelope, but I'm not going to do anything particularly sound design wise in the synths, so that you can kind of hear and see what that actually does. Let's take a quick look at something which you might find interesting, which is if we kind of duplicate this track over this, let's say the melody track, we copy it over here, and let's say we remove this stock Ableton wavetable here with nothing done to it. It's not a preset of any sorts. And let's say we go over to the instrument panel over here in the browser, and we open up wavetable and we take a look. And something you may not have realized here that's going on is there's a bit of a coding system, and the icons are changing down here through the wavetable. Now, what does that mean? Like, it's a tiny little detail, but essentially, if you see anything in the presets that are .adv files with this little icon here, they are just the wavetable. So what does that mean? Well, if we drag this Zardos over and down here and we take a look at it, as you can see, it's just wavetable. Granted, there are sound design going on inside of it in the envelopes and the LFOs and the filter and the wavetable choice, but there is no processing being added to this synth. So what do I mean by that? Well, if we remove the Zardos and we go back over here, and you'll notice that there are other files in here that say .adg. Well, that is going to look rather different, and that's because that is now a preset of wavetable that has also processing. That means effects could be MIDI as well as audio, but it is a rack. It's an instrument rack that Ableton, obviously the designers of these patches, have built it into a rack. So if you want to do a bit of learning about processing, programming audio effects, if you grab a .adg synth, let's listen to the yin yang, quite nice. If you grab something that's .adg and you come down the side here to the show and hide tabs, if you go to the second tab up from the bottom and we click that, you'll notice that that expands the instrument of what's going on in the side, and you can see that we've got the wavetable, right, which makes sense. So you can obviously study about what's been done inside of the wavetable synth, but what's key here is we can kind of see, okay, there's a delay that's been added to that and a reverb. And if you really wanted to go a step further, you can also start looking at wherever there's little green dots like this. This is telling us that those things are mapped. They're part of this front panel here, which is telling us that if it's all closed up like it was originally, again, the patch designer, preset designer has set some macros here that you can play around with without opening it up and test out the sounds and make some changes and automate those things and design your own, tweak the patch a bit. If you want to go a step further, as I said, you can go in here and take a look at what's going on. And the thing is as well is, let's say we just bring this to life a little bit. Or maybe we'll play one of the other ones. If we wished to start with this particular patch, but we don't want the delay, well, we can switch that off and disable it, right? And if we want the reverb off, we can't sort of disable that, but we could come over to the space knob, which no doubt is to do with that, and knock it off. So, you know, you can add and remove effects to this patch. So we could also delete the reverb out of there, like so. I'm going to put it back for now, but you can sort of go in here and modify the patch and learn what's gone on to design it to sound the way and switch things on and off, delete things, add your own things. But that can be a great way to reverse engineer, as it's known, learn some of the things that are going on when these patches and presets are built. So .adg files, .adv, the little icon, that's what's going on there. One last thing, if I click the map box here, you can actually also, in that reverse engineering phase, bring up this tab here and you can see what mappings have been mapped where, how much are the minimum max values, and again, you could add your own custom mapping to that if you wish to do more. So that's not really the biggest exercise for today, but I wanted to point that out because I think it's quite useful to understand that. So one of the things is, if we're not working with a preset like this, so this is a preset with processing, audio effects program to make it sound like it does. If we're not working with that, a great way to potentially start is kind of what we've got in front of us today. And that is actually having a very simple synth tone. In the case of the wavetable here, we've got just a sine wave and no real change to the synth whatsoever. And what we're going to try and do is make it sound a bit more interesting, but in this case, using effects. So we might keep the tone really basic, and we'll try to evolve it using effects. So if we just focus in on the melody, we could choose a sawtooth as our starting point, or a sine wave. If we want a bit more brightness, let's say more harmonics, we can go there. But let's say we start with the sine wave. If we want to change the envelope, as I said, I'm sort of giving myself permission to make it plucky, or we could go the other way and make it like an organ envelope or a very slow attack. But that doesn't really suit this sound, so we're going to sort of leave that fairly much as it is. So let's now look at, with this synth sound, some audio effects, right? So I've kind of laid out over to the right here. We'll come to this track in a little bit of time, but I've kind of added to these individual tracks some of the effects which I think provide what's written at the top. And something we will need to consider as we work with audio effects and program them is potentially what's known as signal flow. And that is, what is the order of these effects? How are they working in the chain of the audio signal on the track? So I've kind of laid these out in a way where you would typically perhaps do it. You might have your creative things first, which might really mangle and change the sound a lot. You might then have the character sounding devices, then something that might change the pitch, then something that might change the spatial or stereo field, then adding some movement perhaps to the sound, and then finally modulation, which could almost actually live anywhere. It's over to the far right, but the modulation is moving things around and adding interest without really, let's say, having such a big effect on maybe the signal flow like the others will in terms of how things sound. It's going to make a difference to how things feel and how things move and change and evolve, but sound-wise, character before pitch, before spatial, before movement could be something to think about. Another thing to say about today's video, I'm looking at insert effects versus return, send and return effects. Now, hopefully a lot of you already will know what that's all about, but let's just say, as basic as it is, an insert effect is where we grab something like, let's say, Ableton's Raw, and we bring it over. I'm just going to use Alt-Option to copy and drag a copy of it over to the melody track. And I put the Raw directly behind the wavetable. That's an insert effect. If the Raw was a send and return effect, then we would be opening up our return tracks over here, and we'd be creating a brand new return track. And then we would go and we would be adding the Raw to that new return track. And that would then bring in on the melody track here a brand new knob over here. So we've now got A, B, and C, and B is now related to that return. So Raw is on a return, and we now have a send that relates to that return. But as I said, we're not really going down that track today. We're going to be going down inserting the effects directly behind the instruments. Maybe another day we'll look at send and returns and what is the value of working that way. But I think for what I wanted to show you today, it's much better in the sense of having the effects in the capacity of them being a insert effects. So let's say with this melody, we've got a basic sine wave, not much happening. Let's say we introduce a little bit of character to it. And let's say if we're working with Ableton Live 11 and we're not up to 12 yet, let's also copy this rack over. And let's say that basically Raw in 12 is a quite amazing device because it actually does almost everything over to the right here that I've got showing up in this little rack I've built for those of you in 11, which I put inside of this rack, a copy of the amp audio effect, the overdrive, the pedal, and the redux. Pretty much everything you can do with those individual effects, you can kind of do just inside of the Raw. So that's what makes that kind of quite an incredible effect in the sense of where we've arrived with Ableton Live 12 and Raw coming as a part of that. So let's say we look to add a little bit of character with, okay, let's say we're not using Ableton 12, so we could switch on this rack. Let's turn off everything and just one at a time have a listen to what they bring. So amp should give us some more harmonics. And perhaps what we'll do as well is we'll grab an oscilloscope and we'll just drop that over to the right of that rack. So we can kind of see what's going on, because if we switch this off, we've got a Raw sine wave in our oscilloscope. If we turn it on, not much change at this point in time, but if we try out some of the other amp sections, you can see we're kind of adding some crunch with the boost. Quite I quite like the boost there. And if you look at the other basic controls of the amplifier, we've got a dry wet, so we can sort of say straight away how much of that influence do we want. It'll be really subtle, which is often in my sounds. Something like that. I'm not looking to destroy the sound, I'm just looking for a little bit of character to happen. By the way, if you're here with me in the live stream, if you can let me know if the microphone level is fine and if the audio level of the music is okay as well, that would be very much appreciated. All right, so we can dial in how much with the dry wet. Something else to point out is the output of the amp. It's worth keeping that in mind because it currently mentions at the top here, I'll just come back to in a second, but I wanted to grab another little tool so we can see what's going on. Let's add a copy of our ozone image here as well. And we can kind of see our signal is in mono inside of the imager. And if we were to change the output like here, you can see that the amp can also start to introduce a bit of stereo. Maybe with some of the different concepts it might be a little bit heavier, but with this particular sound at the moment it's not making a huge change, but I quite like to know that I'm keeping it in mono, so I will go backwards to putting it back into mono and back to that setting that I had around 6.35. So it's worth checking that. That's the reason it has this box at the top there, so you can play around with that. So already we've got a little bit of interest from what we had before. Let's now say the overdrive, which does a similar thing. So let's turn off the amp, turn on the overdrive. Let's have a look at the oscilloscope. So we can see again, we're adding some character, a bit different, wave shape. What if we drive it? Again, we can overdrive it, as the name on the effect says. Tone, darker or brighter. We've got a built-in filter here, so we can kind of filter the overdrive to a certain amount. Whatever's below here is being overdriven. Whatever's outside of the filter around the edges here is not being touched. So we can narrow down what's being overdriven and also concentrate it in different areas of the frequency, right? So it's got a bit of range to it. And then down the bottom here, we can adjust the dynamics and again the dry wet. So perhaps if we have it again really low, it's already making quite a difference. I like that. Does it work with the amp? It does. They both contribute something. And now what starts, which I was mentioning earlier a little bit, is this concept of signal flow. Could we put the amp behind the overdrive? The answer is absolutely yes. Does it sound different? It does. So you might prefer the amp coming after the overdrive. You might prefer it coming before it. I kind of like it after the overdrive because it kind of brightens it up a little bit. Right, pedal. That came new in Ableton 11. It's designed to give us some of this kind of guitar pedal feel. So let's again switch those two off, take a look at it. It's currently in overdrive in the middle here. We can move it through those three pedal types, and fuzz is obviously the most aggressive with the most noise, distorts somewhere in the middle, and overdrive is quite clean at this point in time. We've then got our dry wet down the bottom here. We've also got this kind of little mini EQ in the middle that we can kind of boost frequencies or cut them, so we can kind of similar to the overdrive's EQ. We can focus a bit where the pedal's working, and you can kind of switch this switch across as well to focus just on that particular frequency. There's also this little sub toggle frequency down here, which adds an extra kind of low boost down the bottom here. On this one, as I said, it kind of selects the frequency of the mid control. Sorry, I made a mistake there. I just saw that popped up on the info tab. This actually decides kind of like what happens in the mid frequency control, this little switch here when you move it around. And then we've got the dry wet. So again, that would be fairly obvious. You can also boost it with the gain. But I'm going to leave the pedal off, I think. I don't really see that adds anything that the amp and the overdrive didn't cover. Perhaps instead of the overdrive, I could use it. That's quite nice. Before the amp. And again, it could go after the amp. Same as the overdrive. I quite like whether the overdrive or the pedal, I like them before the amp. But I still kind of am leaning towards those two. And then finally, Redux can give us this kind of lo-fi effect where we can bring down the bit rate to a lower bit rate than 16, and then the frequency. So obviously you can hear with the Redux, things can get pretty crazy with that. So that could lead us to some pretty wild kind of lead type sounds or something really unique. And if we mess around with the rate and the bit rate, we're going to get more and more crunchy and messed up. The lower the bit rate, the lower the frequency and the lower the bit rate. And now that we're in 12, they did upgrade this slightly. You've got jitter, so you can kind of add some wobble to the actual harmonics that it's creating, and you can also shape the jitter a bit as well, so you can kind of smooth it out or let it get a bit more aggressive. So another interesting effect Really interesting. So we could maybe have this, again, bring down the dry wet. Now what happens if we move it in the signal flow? Nice. So this is something I've always learned to do. You know, I like to put things firstly into a rack like this. I like to minimize them sometimes. So that just means simply double clicking them to minimize them. And I can kind of move them around in the rack, switch it off. We know we've created quite a difference already. And then decide what is each bringing to the table. And another thing that's also really useful to do is wherever you're looking at meters, it's kind of like balancing out, you know, what's going on in the metering. So what do I mean by that? Let's see if we can find a simple gain here. So we've got this simple little gain. This is a Max for Live device, by the way. You should be able to find that in Max for Live. And if we put that either side of the rack here, we've got a before and an after. And that then means that if we're kind of trying to do this in a correct sense, we can see here what we're inputting into our rack and what's coming out in the output. And if it's a lot louder here, we kind of know that we potentially need to back things off a little bit. It's pretty close. My ears kind of were telling me that, but you know, if anything, we could come down slightly here on the output one, right? And that would be rebalancing things. If you don't have this gain device, you can see that Ableton devices have the gain either side. So you could look at the wavetable here, and then let's say we minimize these and switch them off. It's a little bit more fiddly. I hope Ableton in the future makes a bigger view of this, but you can kind of see the wavetable level here, and then you can kind of see post effects, what's going on. And again, if you don't have that gain plugin, not an issue at all. Just go into here and bring down your dry wet slightly on each device, and that's what's creating the boost in the signal, right? Or alternative to that, you could grab yourself a utility. This is actually probably the easiest way. Pop it at the end of the rack here and just use the gain there till you see that the output matches the input, right? I think we're pretty close. And what we should have is quite a good tonal difference, which we do, but not really with a boost in volume. That's the whole reason for balancing the input with the output, right? That's the whole reason for doing this. And as I said, if you want to take it up a notch, you can look at something like this. And again, actually, let's have a look at the utility now and see if it's kind of working even with those two. Looks really good. There's our sort of peaking up here. And we're peaking about there. We could probably even go up slightly. So there we go. We've kind of matched those with those effects in between. All right, so that's kind of like taking a simple synth sound, and let's kind of switch a few things off here. Just have our basic drums with this synth sound. So we've now got something more out of it. Sorry, I realize that we're over here, right? Hang on, just let me get myself there, sorry. So we've got our wavetable a little bit more interesting without doing anything in terms of, you know, changing the synth or anything like that. We've now got this kind of pattern there. So what else could we do? Well, we've adjusted the character, okay? And I've used basically what I would call the legacy effects of Ableton Live in a lot of these distortion saturation devices instead of raw this time round. So if you're working in 11, you can use those. The other thing we could do, speaking of distortion and character, we could also bring back on our melody track here the saturation device. And we could drop it into the rack if we like, and we could drive the saturator a bit. Again, just balancing the output to match. put that where we prefer it. Kind of like it there. And then we could try out some of the other saturator shapes. And once again, we've got a wet dry, we can balance this out. And as you can hear, as you go down through those initial shapes, it gets more, you know, subtle versus more aggressive. So, you know, Ableton's good old-fashioned saturator has always been a good device for adding depth and character to your sounds. And so how are we doing on our balance of audio? Again, you know, have we added character but not really added volume? Pretty good. Maybe a slight, again, just backing off on the saturator, on the utility, sorry. But we've got all that character out of a sine wave, essentially, which had no character, with all those kind of character inducing kind of effects, right? And so, moving on from that, what else could we do? Well, we could kind of play around with the pitch and tone of this. We could go into spatial territory, so why don't we take a look at that? Let's say we bring over some chorus to that track. I'm just going to minimize raw. I'm going to do another copy in a moment of this same synth, I think, with raw, so you can kind of see what happens when we do that. So let's have a chorus there. Let's have a look. We'll also can have delay and effects. So let's say we bring these over. Again, they're all switched off at the moment. And what I'll probably do actually while I'm doing that is, while I'm over here, I'm going to build myself a rack. So I'm literally just going to click on all of these effects I've dropped into that particular track over there, shift and select them all, Command G to pop them in a rack. And if you want to take this another step further, we can now label this rack, you know, the spatializer or whatever you'd like to call it, you know, and you've now got this lovely rack. And this is kind of where this sort of technique starts, that we can now actually go back over here, kind of get rid of the chorus there. And instead of what I was just doing, we can now go and grab this rack, bring that over and drop that on the melody track, right? And the same as this first rack that I had here, this one also could be labeled here as our character, helps if I spell properly, character builder. Right, and so those little racks like that, you could start building them, dropping your favorite effects in there. This is what audio effect programming is all about, and we start building chains of effects and putting them in these racks. And the great thing is then you can drag this rack, you can save it in your user library, and you can drag it into any projects, pop it behind a synth sound or something else and start working on it. Reorder the effects. It can be there switched off just like that, and then you can turn it on, and you can turn on or off individually all the things inside, so we can minimize that. We've now got the spatializer, so let's have a listen. Let's pop on the chorus. Let's maybe have a little bit of the warmth knob, just to add a little bit of tonal character from the chorus. Can already hopefully hear that things got quite a bit wider, right? So let's minimize the other effects. We don't have to worry too much about the oscilloscope because harmonics aren't going to really change too much. Let's just check that with the chorus. Not too much change, but on the imager, a lot of change, right? So we've stereoized this melody, okay, giving it a lot of kind of width, and we might even to watch out for that. If we're giving it too much width, we might bring the dry wet back down a little bit, kind of reel things in a little bit. So as you can see, I'm kind of controlling that a little bit. In the chorus itself, we're in classic, which has got the yellow and blue here of the left and right sides of the signal. If we go ensemble, we kind of get 3 signals, center, left and right, which is kind of nice. You've got a built-in EQ here, and then you've got the rate of the chorus, so you can slow the chorus down or turn it up and you start to get vibrato because you're wobbling then the pitch, right? We'll look at that in a little bit. And the same with the chorus and the amount, more LFO, less LFO. Essentially think of the chorus like a sine wave LFO working on the left and right part of your signal, or left, right and middle, and giving it some nice movement and width here. So I'm liking that. Let's now go into the delay or the echo. Essentially for me, a little bit like with the choices we have with raw versus the older effects if we're in 11. I personally use the echo most of the time, but there are occasions where I use the standard delay as well. But echo kind of offers us the standard delay and more. So, you know, they both have their merits. It's just a question of what you want to do and how far do you want to take things. So let's say maybe on this track we use for the moment the standard delay, and we'll find in a moment something where we add the echo to it. So over here we've got our left and right channels of the delay. 3 represents how many sixteenths. Currently they're both 3/16 delay on the left and right channel. If we click the box in the middle, we can unsync the 2 delays from the 2 sides from each other, and we went wider, as you can see up here. Let's put that back. And what that means is when we go 3/4, for example, switch off the 2 of them being synced, we've now got a 1/4 delay on the right hand side of our hearing, and on the left we've got an 1/8 dotted, as it's known. So just think of these numbers here as the number of sixteenths, 1/16, 2, and if you're good at maths, that's an 1/8 note delay, 1/8 dotted, 1/4 note, 1/4 dotted, onwards, right? That's kind of what's going on this side. If we take it out of sync mode, note sync, so let's put it back to here, we're now working in time, in milliseconds, and if we shift it to time in milliseconds, things can get really wild. So if we're sound designing with the delay, we can go between the lines, between the note synced values. And these things become really fun. So if you're looking for wild delays and kind of, you know, making perhaps your own effects or things like that, turning a delay into milliseconds and time mode is going to be one of your best friends to do that. But let's get it back to a bit more conventional in this case. And keep it like that. We've got a filter in the middle again, so we can really control in the center here how much of what we're feeding in is delayed. So again, what's below the frequency, the filter, should I say, curve is what's being kept, and outside of that, it's not being affected by the delay. So you can hear when we open the filter right up, everything's being delayed. As we bring that down, it's much more controlled. So perhaps we just want the high frequencies with the delay on them, or more in the mids, or a little bit lower. And again, looking at this from an advanced perspective, what I was just doing there, so let's set the filter up like this. We could automate this. Or have an LFO doing that. Which kind of leads us nicely to, as you come down the bottom here, they're kind of a bit like the chorus has this kind of rate and amount, kind of like an LFO going on inside of it. Well, the delay kind of has a modulation section, and if we move the filter down here, we add a value to the mod filter, then we're doing kind of what I just did. So you can now hear at 100%, it's moving our filter around for us, and we could dial that into a, say, 50%. And it's effectively doing that for us at a certain value. If you don't like the fact that you can't really sort of see that, like what is exactly the movement that's happening. Well, maybe let's go and do something about that. Let's change how we're doing this. Let's say we add an LFO instead from the audio effects category, and let's say we map that to the frequency here, and let's hit play. I did actually think we would see the filter moving around. Let me just, yeah, there we go. So if I switch it over to remote, you can see what I'm doing to the filter. And now we can kind of adjust how much. So maybe let's lower the depth a little bit so it's a bit more slower. And the rate, get a very slow sweeping around. And then we can adjust our width. And if we wish to be able to move this filter frequency here, because as you can see, I can't currently adjust that. If we switch our LFO from remote back to mod, you can see that I can actually reset the position of the filter if the LFO is set to mod mode. But as you can see, when it's in mod mode, you can't see the movement of the filter and the delay, but that's easy enough to then go back and switch it to remote. So let's maybe take it and make it a bit wilder with the LFO. We can go with a bit faster. And let's say we change our wave shape. So now the movement's completely random. So it's really your imagination and your creativity as to how far the limit is with what I'm doing here, right? Square will give us a real glitchy on-off. Let's try a downwards ramp. And then we'll note sync it. So again, we're working currently in frequency at the moment. So let's have I would say a sensible setting for now. I'm enjoying what I'm doing there. I hope you're finding it beneficial to look at some of these things like that. But as you can see, putting an LFO here as opposed to using this modulation section of the delay and adding a percentage to the filter, it gives you a little bit more clue as to what's kind of actually going on inside of here visually, which could be helpful, I think, for a lot of people, particularly when you're learning about these things. So let's just have a nice bit of movement. Let's maybe change our delay a bit. So as you can see, you can also work with synced on one side, time on the other. Just a dry wet a little bit. Nice. So we'll come back to the echo in a bit, but in this case we've gone with the delay. I'll just point out as well that in this modulation section down here, we've also got the rate and the time, right? So you can kind of see over here, if we play around with the modulation of the time, things are going to get wonky. It's going to adjust the timing of the left and right. Which is quite wild, but again, you might just bring a little bit of that in. Just so it's got a little bit of interest to it. We can also play around with the rate of this filter, but we already are, so there's no need for that really. The amount of the filter, we could still adjust in here, but I think what I've sort of got it doing at the moment is kind of nice in itself with this LFO gently sweeping it around the EQ of the delay. So looking at our meter here, we've got pretty wide, so let's maybe just bring the dry wet slightly down. Okay. And now maybe a little bit of reverb in the spatialness. And again, we have, like a lot of the effects in Ableton Live, choices. We've got a standard reverb and we've got the hybrid reverb. So again, for me, since we've had hybrid reverb in the toolbox, there are times when I use, again, the default reverb, but in general, reaching most of the time for the hybrid. I think it's lovely. It offers kind of everything the normal reverb offers us, let's say, and beyond that. For starters, it works with what's called a convolution reverb on one side and an algorithmic on the other. Perhaps we'll deep dive on the reverb one day, but the convolution side of it is real, what's called impulse responses. So the reverb is taking real recordings of real world signs and building a reverb around what it actually sounds like in, for example, if we go through to real places, what it actually sounds like if you make a sound inside some of these places like the Abbey Temple, etc. They've gone and recorded the impulse response of that place, and that is the file that you see inside of here. So you get very realistic sounding reverbs in a nutshell. So hybrid reverb on this sound as well, why not? Just to get a little bit of spatialness, and I'm going to leave it pretty much in its default for now, early reflections. And I'm just going to bring the dry wet down a bit. And let's kind of have a little look at where we are with what we sort of started with. So we've got these two racks, the character one and the spatializer. Let's switch them off. So we've come quite far, right? And that's just with, again, just to point out, if you're only just joining the stream now, we've done nothing to the synth here. We've just got a very simple MIDI pattern. And we're using a standard wavetable on a sine wave, nothing more. But with effects, we've developed it into this kind of pretty interesting, I think, sound. And it could get nasty if we want to go back in here and look at some of the things I showed you earlier, like Redux. Right, so Redux could bring us a lot more grit and character. We could also overdrive the sound more. Sounds really nice. So my initial percentage is really conservative. Maybe we go a bit harder now. It might mean we need to adjust a little bit our output versus our input again, because we've no doubt probably boosted that. Right, which you can see we have. So again, we've got that utility where we can just reel it in a little bit. We've got a lot more character coming out of that sound, right? So the character builders, I think, working quite nicely. And then the spatializer, making a big difference, right? Also, now the chorus has something quite interesting in the middle, in this bottom section here. We've also got feedback, which can get pretty wild as well. It can create some really interesting extra tones as the output feeds back in to the device. And you can also flip the polarity of that feedback if you wish. Right, so we're kind of going around on a second pass here and kind of spicing things up a little bit, going a little bit further. We're already pretty wide, so I don't think we need the ping pong. Maybe over here on the hybrid, we'll look at this little vintage section over here on the right. So you can add more kind of character and grit. Let's just check our imager, how we're doing. Not too bad. We can also bring the width of the reverb in a little bit at the top here. So I think that little experiment is kind of working well, and it's kind of working in the way I wanted to show you, that we've got a very simple waveform here and we're taking it somewhere completely new. And the tip with that actually is that when you're starting to kind of learn how to use the audio effects and program them well, I'd really, really recommend that you start with the most minimum notes that you really need. Just start in the piano roll with something very simple. It can literally be just a couple of notes from a scale. So maybe we're in A minor and we take the root note, and then we have, let's say, the third and then the fifth. So we could literally have something as simple as that. Maybe we put the C back in, it gives us 4 notes again. Right, and you can try with the effects to make the most simplest of patterns become something that's a lot more interesting than just purely simple. So again, if we turn off these groups of effects, it wouldn't be super inspiring and lead us to sort of, well, like, oh wow, that's great. But with these 2 racks we've kind of built here, no fancy presets or anything on the synth here. Maybe we change the wavetable from sine to saw. That would give us more character for sure. Or square if you like. And the only other thing I suggested I would allow myself to do is adjust the amp envelope of the synth. So as you can hear, a lot of sounds in there, and that's just using these 3 notes that I just quickly plugged in, right? And then you can add a few more notes if you wish, but you know, that's sounding really, really interesting, with basically, you know, all those effects doing the work. All right, so let's just play through the different the different MIDI here. Got my tongue twisted up there, that I had already on this track. So that's the one we're kind of started with. So with some of these, there's a little bit too much redux now for my taste, so I'm going to back that off a bit. And you can go through and sort of, maybe we take redux out of this, maybe we bring the dry wet of the overdrive back down again so it's not quite so wild. Pop into the spatializer rack. Let's bring the feedback down. Right, so, you know, for the different MIDI, it all kind of works well, and we can adjust it depending on what our outcome is, what we're looking for there. But if we just come back to those simple notes, as I said, the big tip is start just with something like this and then work hard on getting this is a way to learn how the effects what they can bring to the table, and build these little racks and start playing around with that side of it. And you can see that you can often start with just a simple synth tone. So tip of the iceberg there really, because we've got more effects that we could add in here that would bring further movement to this sound, and also modulation, where we can sort of, again, get it to be more expressive and changing over time. So I'd like to kind of maybe show you some other sounds. Maybe we'll quickly stay on the same melody, let's say, for a second longer, and just so let's say, for movement's sake, we again build ourselves a little rack here, pop these two together, and we're going to call this one drop in a bit of Spanish for the Spanish fans. Let's have movimiento and pop it over onto the melody track. And again, it looks a bit busy here because we've got some things that we haven't been using, but we've kind of been minimizing. So let's bring all those over to the front there, keep them out the way. We can minimize the character builder rack. We've got the spatializer. Now we've got the movimiento. We might bring that in behind the spatializer. Bring in a little bit of auto pan. We can get that kind of movement from left to right, bit around our head in this sine wave shape here. We could try out some other waveforms. Completely random what's going on with the panning, or a ramped left to right change, or triangular, or sine wave, but that starts to add, again, this nice bit of movement, the amount, how much. So if it's very subtle, you might just have a little bit, how quickly it moves left to right. So we could have this in hertz, again in frequency, fast left to right, or really slow. It's kind of very slowly sweep left to right. We can also change the phase between the left and right. So they're sort of wonky apart from each other, or they're synced together. The shape of our waveform, as well as the waveform, we can also modify it further. We can flip polarities, and we can also note sync the pans. So that could mean that, let's say if we choose 1 here, every bar it's moving left to right, or every 2 bars. So that could be a nice addition. I don't think we'll use the phaser on this sound, but let's have a listen if we added a phaser. Could be really interesting, right? If we want that kind of, again, sweeping left to right, phaser flanger sound. Again, we might want to keep an eye on the ozone imager just to make sure we understand what's happening in our stereo field, but we are currently in okay shape, because the more we add these things, the more we're kind of spreading our signal around in the stereo field and left and right. But we're okay at this point in time. Phaser flange is interesting. Let's maybe change the rate a bit. So I think that's really, really nice. So that's subtle bit of flanging, phasing, and again, dry wet, we can, none of that effect whatsoever. Somewhere around there, I quite like it. Don't think I have the panning as well, so in this case with the movimiento rack I'm going to go with the flanger as a nice touch. And again, now that we've got these 3 racks, you can also move the racks around for the signal flow. So we could flange before the spatializer or phase before the saturation, and it all sounds different, right? So that's the phaser at the very beginning after the synth now. We can ignore this. This is just our, by the way, little gain monitor. Versus at the very end. So it's modular, it's phasing everything that happened before it. Here it's phasing and everything else is happening afterwards in the middle. It's kind of doing a mix. I mean, you can let me in the chat where you prefer it, but quite like it at the start actually. So all of these, there's no law that no one's going to leap through the window and tell me, hey Heath, you can't do that. The only thing we need to watch out for, as I said, is some of the meters and things that might make things life a little bit easier when we get to the mixing stage. But I'm not breaking any rules that are, you know, it's not possible to do that. It's your ears and your hearing that's telling you whether you like it or not. So the spatializer, if we put it at the end, I kind of had it nicely controlled in the stereo field. I guess if I do put it here, things do get a little bit more potentially out of phase, so I might need to adjust it slightly if it lives in the front. But again, just to revisit, let's switch these guys off. That's what we have without any effects. And if we change the MIDI, so as you can hear on the simple, you know, couple of notes, it works very well. As the elements get busier, we start to get more blending of the effects together as well as the music itself. And we would need to really, for the piano chords, for example, kind of do our racks a bit so they allow for those, the build up of all the music and the notes. But where we've got space, we start to find the racks work better. So it's mainly with the character rack in this one that I'd make it a bit more subtle for my taste. But when we come back to the simple pattern, lots of room. Nice. All right, so let's have a look at something else then. Let's have a look at, using audio effects and programming them in Ableton Live somewhere else in this equation. We've worked quite hard on this melody track with the different MIDI in it, and we've taken a raw wavetable and given it a new lease of life with some of these spatial effects, some of the character building effects, some of the movement effects. Okay, it looks like I removed my rack from there, so I'll also add it back to there. And we've been building these little racks with the devices inside them as well as we've gone along. Modulation, we can also come back and visit that we can, as I said, get more and more interest into that particular pattern, melody, and what we've got going so far. But I think it's good to also take a look at some of the other things I've got in here and what we can do with them. So let's say that an interesting thing that we can do is on the creative side of things, we've got some interesting effects, and one of them is beat repeat. And I think beat repeat is a really interesting audio effect, and I do see it as something really creative because we're able to use it to create kind of variations and little kind of like fills and pattern changes. And even though it says beat on the device, we don't have to strictly just stick to using it on beats. So let's have a look at it, perhaps on a bass line here, where again, less is more. So not too many MIDI notes. We don't actually want a busy pattern, the same as we are finding with the melody, that when we're learning this, it's easier to work with a simple pattern. It gives us space, and we're kind of using the effects to make the interest where the notes are really simple and plain, right? So what have we got on this bass track? Super simple analog synth. It's currently 2 oscillators. Let's maybe just bring the envelope to being plucky. And I'm not going to do too much else. We could have a second oscillator. Maybe just detune it slightly. But again, I wanted to try and keep the sound quite basic. Although with this one, the first thing we're going to do is use the beat repeat, but we're going to try and get creative with it to create new bass notes for us effectively. So if we switch it on, straight off the bat, it's giving us a fill. And what's the fill? What's going on under the lid here? How's it doing that? Well, what's going on along the top of the beat repeat is that the interval is a bar. So again, every bar that it cycles through, and I think we've only got a bar here. No, we've got 2. So that's good. So every time we're in a bar, there's going to be a variation created by this beat repeat. It's currently going to create a 16th note variation. The offset knob next door decides where in the bar does the variation happens. So right now there was no offset, so it was happening right at the point where the bar starts. But if we change that, then we can shift in 16ths along through the steps in the bar and say, okay, I want the little variation to happen as we go along through there. So that's what's going on the top. We also have the ability to add a variation to each time there's a repeat created. We can also actually have different kind of variations of the grid timing if we use this variation knob, which is quite interesting. So we won't get the same thing happening each time, and you can go all the way up to 10. So it could be, I think the thing you want to think about with beat repeat, you can have it so it's a predictable thing that happens each time it generates something, or you can have it that it's more interesting than that. Down the bottom, we have some ability to decide the chance of it creating a repeat. It's currently at 100%, so we could dial that back if we wanted, again, to reduce that for some reason. The gate is the length of the repeat. So if we kind of hover over these again and you open up the info panel, it's telling us gate defines the total length of the repetitions in 16th notes. So if the gate is 4/16, the repetitions will occur over the period of a beat. So think of this about like how long the repetition occurs for. 4/16 is a whole beat, a quarter note. So again, it's a bit like the delay we're using our maths here. 7/16 is, a a lot more than a quarter note. So we're adding, you know, more. The gate will kind of decide on the total length of the repetitions in 16th notes. Offset, as I said, shifts the point defined by interval control forward in time. The interval set to the bar and the offset is 8/16. Materials will be captured for repetition once per bar on the third beat. So I won't read that for you. You can check it yourself, but let's have a listen when we move some of these things around to what actually happens with our bass. So let's say 2 bars. We're just going to get 1 beat repeat created every 2 bars, every 1 bar, right? Half a bar, or smaller, every quarter note, or 4 bars, which is kind of the maximum there, right? And if we want something a little bit interesting, we could say 1 bar and 2/16. So you start to get these odd fills. Nice. We could also change from 16th to 8th notes. And then we could say, okay, we'll vary up what this grid is doing. Right, so you can hear it's coming up with different combinations now. And if you wish to not have triplets as part of that combination, you can turn no triplets on down here, so it won't play any triplet values. And things going to get also wild every time it does like its repeat. We can also have this pitch decay, which can sound pretty wild, because then it pitches down those repeats. Right, and this thing is an absolute weapon. And if we sort of, it can do this really lovely kind of, as I said, creating new variation and interest. And by all means, we can automate it to switch on and off. We could add LFOs to take this into really advanced territories. But let's say for starters, we just want some variation from it, which we're currently getting. Let's say we want to really glitch things up when it does the repeat. Let's move the grid here to a really small amount. So I'm really liking that. So I'm going to keep the beat repeat like it is at the moment. It's got some source to it. It's going to make these real nice little fast 30-second note repeats. There's a bit of variation on that. It's going to be different, up to 3 times different. So it's not always going to be exactly the same each time it goes around. Let's spice up our analog, much like we did with the melody. Let's bring in our audio effects. Let's say this time we bring in, well, I've kind of done a deep dive with Raw recently in a previous video. I'll link that somewhere up here if you like, so you can check out a sound design video where I went kind of more into what Raw can do. Let's go back to these legacy effects again that you will have if you're working in 11. Put them behind the beat repeat. And let's turn them individually off. And I kind of want to reset these. Well, it's good there actually are in their default positions, which is great. Bit of amp could be nice here. Just again, very subtle on the dry wet. I don't think I'll be using the others, just that tiny little bit of amp here, and I'm going to add a saturator to this rack. And I'm going to trust my ears to balance this out so that off, that's the input coming in. It's fair to say we've added some nice character, but we probably could bring the output down slightly. Kind of happy with that. Just looking to, again, if we do check input into the effects, sitting about there at the peak, down here near to the E or T on the RMS. RMS is much higher here. Peak is a little bit still higher. But the RMS is good because that's because we've added all that character, right? So nice, we've got the beat repeat kind of glitching things up. We've got the rack afterwards giving a bit of character. What else might have a look at? Now, a lot of these things we could do inside the synth itself, but let's say we're going to go the route of audio effects instead, as we're wanting to learn those. Let's have an LFO. And instead of using the built-in synth LFO, let's map this LFO here to some targets. And let's map it to the envelope amount of the filter. So we're kind of changing the filter frequency envelope amount with an LFO outside of the synth. Let's put it in note sync. Let's try ramp down. Again, I'm just going to change from, well, mod is good because I can move the envelope amount. Let's have it a fairly slow LFO. And let's have our melody in from earlier and see if we can play that with what we've got. By the way, if you're here with me in the live stream, do let me know, do say hello, drop a comment in the chat, give us a wave. If you've got any questions, pop them in the chat there and I'll do my best to answer them. Today we're looking at audio effects programming in Ableton Live and just diving into kind of taking raw sounds in this case, no presets, no patches, and we're kind of making those raw sounds more interesting through the use of effects. It could be a great way to work and it can be a great way to learn what these effects can bring to the table. We've also been building nice little racks of these effects, putting them sort of into categories. Also, I will be linking in the description down below a PDF where I've kind of taken a bit of a mind map of the Ableton audio effects and put them into kind of little boxes where each one sort of lives, let's say. But as a disclaimer, there's a lot of overlap. Things can be in more categories than just one. So we've kind of got this so far. And if we visit each, this is the melody, and we turn off the effects we've added. Someone may prefer that, as they may prefer on the bass if we change this. Right, but you can kind of hear what those effects have really done. And one last thing with the beat repeats, by the way, if you actually, would like for that to be printed, what's going on with the beat repeat, that can be done. But in that case, you would be looking to take the bass line into audio. And so you'd make a new audio track and you'd get it to listen to the bass track that we've created. It would be an input track, we'd arm it, and what we'd be doing is wanting to capture the bass pattern that we've got. It's pedaling around on this E note. We'd want to capture the fact that it's got the beat repeat on it, because if it doesn't have the beat repeat on it, let's just turn off that effects for a second and listen to the beat repeat. When we add that, get those lovely little fills. So we'd want to be wanting to capture those bass notes with the repeats, and then we could go through that bass pattern and choose our favorite portion of it. So yeah, I won't go too far with that because we could be here a long time, but the idea is that we'd now have this bass pattern and we could go back through and find our favorite loop of it where that beat repeat is doing its little variations and listen through. We could switch off also all the effects and then add them to the audio track. So actually this could be switched off during the recording process. What do I mean by that? Let's actually do it again. So all we're doing is capturing the synth plus the beat repeat. Let's also maybe turn off the LFO for a moment so that that's not mapped as well. We'll remap that in a moment. Let's just go to the analog and yep, that's all okay. We'll just reset the envelope here to its default. Okay, and this time we are going to again listen to the bass and record it, but we're recording it with the out the effects. Reason being, I'll show you in a second. So let's do this. Because the thing would be, now that we've got this bass over into audio, we could turn this track away from it being an input track and back to a regular audio track, switch it on, turn off our MIDI track, and we could now bring those audio effects in that rack over and add that to the audio effect, to the bass recording of the audio. And then, as I said, we could go through and loop up a favorite area and move it around till we find the section with our favorite repeats. And they're these little kind of sections here and there in between, kind of, yeah, that little kind of nice little fast little glitchy sound. All right, so back, let's kind of put this back, put that back behind the bass, pop away this audio track. It's just wanted to show you kind of like how you can go about kind of deciding on whether those beat repeats are part of the sound and you're completely happy with them being kind of fairly random, or whether you want to record them out and then choose where you like the result of what happened and you use that as your clip, as your bass clip, as opposed to letting it randomly do its thing over time and be happy with it constantly evolving. So I'm just going to remap that to how I had it. So let's now pop over to something else, like the percussion track over here. And this is a percussion loop. Again, I mentioned it sort of earlier, all the sounds being used here today are native Ableton Live instruments and effects, and the sounds, if there are any audio or samples, they're all coming from packs, so they can be searched out and you can find exactly the same sounds yourself. So the reason I've got this percussion track over here is that it's strictly audio at this point in time. And let's say on the percussion track, we also go for a bit of beat repeat. So we had a nice bit of new little fills from the beat repeat, just generating this nice little bit of character in the background, juggling the beat repeat around. Let's go for something a little bit kind of that we haven't looked at so far. So we've already kind of used the beat repeat in a couple of ways, or what it does really well, but we've applied it to a bass, which, as I said, if you look at the title, you think beats needs to be on drums. Well, no, it doesn't. We've looked at sort of delays and reverbs and things. We've looked at the character, devices, amps, overdrives, pedals, but let's go a little bit further along and let's look at something that's sort of, you know, starting to get into the more kind of quite pitch and tone area of the audio effects folder of Ableton Live. And when it comes to tone, the two devices so shifter is great for adjusting and changing the pitch of a sound. We'll look at that in a moment, but the two that come to mind that are really quite powerful audio effects for changing the character and tone, like almost sounding like there's a whole new instrument there, or what's sort of going on, are corpus and the resonators. So one of my favorite things to do, giving away a bit of the special sauce here, is to grab a resonator and pop it on something like a percussion loop, and we can take that percussion loop and turn it into something like a melody. So let's say we grab all of these devices, and again we're going to group them into a little rack that we can share elsewhere. We're going to call this one, let's call it the source. special sauce really. And let's drag a copy of that over onto the percussion, and let's turn on, for starters, the resonator device within the rack. So you can take something that's quite percussive and rhythmical, and you start to get this kind of like melodic character to it. And in this case, I'm going to actually click the hot swap of the resonator, and I'm going to show you that, as all of these devices have, there's a bunch of presets. And I think when it comes to starting with the resonator, one of the best things you can actually do is work your way through these different presets of the resonator and listen to what they can really do to a sound. In its default mode here, you have to understand a lot about kind of the device itself, in the sense of how it works, to really get, you know, results from scratch. Whereas over here we can kind of play around with some of these aptly named resonators, and I think Berlin is a great one to start with. Let's bring the dry wet down. So we can mix how much of the percussion sits with the resonator. So nice, still get a lot of the percussion, or we can go complete the other way. So the percussion's just providing this kind of almost melody of sorts. Let's try out some of the other percussion loops here. So the last loop there was a bit too busy, but this one's not so busy, so we can kind of tell that it's fitting a little bit better with our other sounds. And if we really wanted to, we could kind of come into the clip itself, use the beat preserve of the clip envelope, and control a bit the gating of the sound so it's not as full before the resonator. Adjust the beat preservation a little bit. Okay, let's try out some of the other ones. I love Berlin. Brooklyn's nice, a bit darker. So, you know, resonators are amazing for taking other sounds, particularly in this case, like a percussion or rhythmical percussion sounds here, and turning it into almost like a bit of a melody. And absolutely for certain, we can do that with things like samples as well. So perhaps I can find a quick example where we can take a look at something else. Just trying to think where could be a good place. Yeah, all right, let's just try it a different way. Let's do it from within here, as that way again you'll be able to try it out yourself. So we're just looking for a bit of a voice, but ideally something that's a little bit rhythmical. Okay, maybe try this. So we do have to watch a little bit the harmony of the resonator and the what we're applying it to, as some of these things are in key. So kind of not perhaps getting the exact result I was looking for musically. But that could be done with a little bit more planning, where I sort of drag in a vocal and one that sort of rhythmically would sit in there. But for now, we're going to stick with the percussion as the example of the resonator. And we've got our beat repeat in the front there as well. And let's go for a little bit more to develop this sound a little bit further, our percussion sound. So let's say we're coming back to character or creative. I haven't used the echo yet today, so let's have that in a moment. We've got the source rack already there, character rack. Let's put the spatializer rack on the percussion as well. And let's go for a bit of echo. So a little bit of echo with from the spatializer rack, along with the resonator. And the beat repeat. So the beat repeat's giving us these nice little variations. We've now got the resonator giving us this lovely character. I'm using the Roam preset and just dialing in the dry wet a little bit. Then I've added a bit of echo. And I was playing around with, at the moment we're in dotted 16ths. Let's try it. Nice, and I've low cut the echo a little bit, which is one of the nice things. As I said, the echo has a lot more built-in features about it that allows us to get more creative inside of it. And so I've kind of I'm using the low cut of the echo built-in the echo to control the low end a bit of the device. If we go to the modulation tab, we can also, much like the delay, the native delay, also play around with modulating things such as the time and the filter. So we can get this nice kind of movement and wobble as we're now playing around with some modulation in the background of the timing of the left and right delay. Let's have a bit of reverb. Now, would that be instantly recognizable as a percussion track? The dry wet is still giving us, of the resonator, a fair bit of the percussion sound, which will sound nice with everything that we've done without the resonator, but with the resonator. Got this lovely character, this tonal change to it. It's pretty dramatic, as I said, and we use the resonator on vocals and rhythmical material. We can come up with really nice, interesting sounds that can start with percussion and go somewhere completely new. Let's also look at, if we switch off the resonator for a moment and pop on the corpus. Similarly, the corpus is one of these other amazing audio effects in Ableton Live that brings physical modeling, like a real world sound. What happens if we hit a beam, a marimba, a string sound, a membrane, a plate, pipe or tube? We've got that built into an effect, which is also basically what the collision instrument is, essentially corpus. It's the same kind of, so if we open up a MIDI track over here and we pop ourselves a copy of collision on that MIDI track, you'll see that essentially if you understand collision and the resonators within it, then you start to understand corpus. As we see the collision instrument, we've got beam, marimba, string, membrane, plate and pipe and tube inside of a collision, and we've actually got two resonators, so we can stack two lots of that sound. And that's essentially those kind of instruments like collision. They're what's known as physical modeling. They're meant to sound like what happens when, as I said, in the real world, if we hit a tube or a pipe, what sound does that create? And so when we look at corpus as an audio effect, back to corpus, we can turn the corpus on and we can add onto this percussion again a sound of a beam or hitting a tube, and that can again take this sound in a whole new direction, or any sound, because we're almost like layering it with another instrument, let's say, but we're layering it with something that adds a new tone. So right now we're in beam, just default corpus, nothing else. Let's go through the different different sounds or tones we can add. And all I'm doing is using that percussion as the vehicle. It's creating like the sequence for the corpus to, create this extra layer on top, right? So again, we try out different percussion loops here. The cowbell's already quite strong. And if we were to go over here, let's do a quick look for maybe something else. We filter our browser to the pack. So again, if you're a Suite user, you should have access to all of these. Turn on loop, let's say percussion. Let's bring that triangle loop in. Something else. Right, and if we look at the basic section of the corpus here, we're currently in marimba, and then we've got the decay in the material, and the material increases and decreases. The material of the marimba, or whichever sound, like these areas, the decay material, those parameters, they change depending on what you're looking at, essentially. So you see with the tube, the radius of the tube, and the decay. Short, plucky over here, more open over there. So we can make this really lovely layer on there that takes that sound into whole new sonic territories. And we can also pitch the corpus. So right now it's adding a C, the middle C of the piano, onto this percussion audio loop, but we could be somewhere else in our tuning of our scale that we're working in. Kind of mainly in A minor today with what else I had here. Could we use the corpus together with the resonator? We could, but I think it's probably a little bit strong. Let's try it. It's interesting for sure. Let's put the resonator in front. I'd kind of use them independently because I think they're both really beautiful on their own, but that's certainly not wrong to have them together. And again, if we bring up the dry wet on the resonator, we just have to look out for the fact that we're making it sound, nice, and we're keeping the tuning and everything in good shape, because we're playing with two things here that affect the tuning and tone. And so we might need to come back in here and have a look at the musical side of the resonator to make sure everything fits together if we're going to have them to play at the same time. But for now, corpus, lovely. The spatializer's on as well, making quite a difference. Let's again surf through these. Some of these can sound really, really nice, and we have no idea that that isn't a melody, a MIDI and a synth, but it's actually a percussion audio loop playing through corpus and into our spatializer. Let's maybe bring our character device into here as well. Our rack. Let's bring that to the front after the beat repeat. A little bit of overdrive. A saturator as well. Again, keeping an eye out for our input signal, what's coming in here and what's coming out in the output. And if we need to lower the output a little bit, we should do so, just so that we're adding this character, but we're not just adding volume, because it's very easy to add volume. We have many ways to do that. That's our percussion without any of the audio effects. And we've got these other loops we can try out here. The cowbell one's not that successful because it's already, like the triangle, very pronounced by itself. But these other ones are nice. I think my favorite is the one that I originally chose for the demonstration. So let's again maybe just bring down the transient preserve on the loop a little bit as well. And then finally, looking at the clock, as I don't plan here to go over time for 2 hours, I would visit the sustained track that I put here, which has some beautiful chords on it. Let's maybe do something to that to spice it up a little bit, but perhaps this is a project or this idea that I can reopen for another stream and revisit all the things here that we can continue to develop and get our audio effects programming up to speed, level up our skills, try and, hopefully you can see through this how you can take very basic sounds and transform them into a whole new world. And, programming audio effects allows us to do that. And it's as powerful, almost as powerful as, taking an instrument from zero and programming that using some synthesis. So we really can get very, very interesting and new and fantastic sounds with our audio effects when we understand how to use them. So looking over at some of my notes, we've definitely worked with some of the creative tools. Beat, repeat we have, echo we have, character we've looked at. We've kind of not looked at raw today because I've made a previous video which I'm going to link to, where you can check out that, where I've deep dived on that. Pitch and tone, we're now starting to look at the wonderful world of corpus and resonators. Spatial, well, we've looked at chorus, we've also used the delay and the echo and the reverb. We've still got more room to tread in those areas. We've also played with flanger and the panning, but we chose not in the end, well, I chose not in the end not to use the auto pan. And modulation, we haven't even touched that yet, which is all about sort of more movement, more variation, more interest. So let's take a little look at the sustains. Again, just a raw meld. It's playing a sine wave. It's two oscillators. There's nothing else. There's nothing that's been changed on the meld to make it sound any different. It's just playing back this chord progression. I'll probably stick with this one just to keep things in scale. So everything could play together. I think if we, well, that's okay. To my ear, kind of sits okay. So let's say on the sustained chords here, to get a little bit more vibe into them, let's just make sure the release on the synth is long enough. Sounds good. Can always make it longer. So let's take a quick look at two essential kind of effects that we have in our toolbox. Let's do Command F to head over to the browser and let's type in tremolo. And what we should find is that we get a few different versions of it. Maybe what I'll do is actually, rather than looking at it this way, because that's perhaps a bit confusing if I filter to Ableton, I think I'll just clear that and we'll do it a different way because I've got more options than perhaps what we need to focus on. So we're just going to go into Ableton's audio effects here, look for tremolo in a different way. We're going to head to the auto pan from Ableton, open it up so we can see the presets, and you'll see inside of the presets of auto pan there is tremolo. So let's drag and drop that behind the meld here, the synth. And let's also pop over to the chorus. We've already got one, but we're going to again dig into the presets of chorus, and we can find in there vibrato, special, subtle, kaleidoscope. Let's just have subtle vibrato for the moment, and we can edit that ourselves. Now let's start with the tremolo. So we've got these chords playing along, basic meld, no change whatsoever to the synth. Let's add some tremolo to kind of get some interest happening here. So tremolo, if you're not familiar with it, is again one of these really powerful audio effect processors that you're probably quite used to hearing it being used all over the place, but it's essentially an LFO or modulation of the volume. So the amp, whatever the volume or amplitude of this synth and these chords is, the tremolo is going to wobble that up and down bringing the volume up and down in that kind of motion. And then if we look at the tremolo at the moment, we can see we've got a sine wave going on inside the tremolo. The amount is how much tremolo that's happening, and it's currently synced to an eighth note. So every eighth note, we've got a sine wave wobbling the tremolo, wobbling the amplitude or volume of this synth sound. And it's a lovely sound, tremolo, on a guitar, on synths, and we've instantly got this kind of vibe and movement. Let's set it to quarter notes. Could be really subtle. Let me just open my release slightly on the synth. Also the attack, so we just get rid of that click. A little bit better. Okay, let's go for our tremolo. Right, if we want it slower, and maybe not note synced. Sometimes when you add these things, we might need to adjust the volume a little bit post. We lose a little bit of volume going through the tremolo as we pulse it. And if we change the shape of it, triangular movement as opposed to smooth sine wave or a ramp. Nice, right? Completely random. That probably needs a bit of work to make that sound nice. So again, we've got movement into our synth here. Sounds static, it's sustained, it's now moving. Let's say we put the vibrato in front of the tremolo and look at the other character that's been around in music for a very long time, vibrato. So tremolo is volume and vibrato is pitch. And now we can make the pitch wobble a little bit on this particular track. So I've just switched the tremolo off for a second. And we've now got vibrato in this chorus turned on over here. And if we start to bring up the amount, you get that classic VHS tape recording, warping kind of wobbling sound. And the faster we make it, the more we get those kind of sounds. Or if we slow it down, so you can have it very subtle or it can be quite extreme. It's up to your taste. I'm going to make it quite subtle. Let's switch it off, make sure we can hear. That's making a difference. Let's have the tremolo now. Put the tremolo in front. bring our stereo spatial rack in, our spatializer, just to finish this sound off. Let's have a little bit of chorus, but in this case, no vibrato from the chorus, just a regular chorus. Just going to back this off again a little bit. Nice bit of reverb, get some spatialness happening. So we've got tremolo, vibrato, wobbling the pitch, pulsing the amp or the amplitude of the volume, and now a little bit of spatialness. That's how it sounded before. Static, vanilla. We've now got this kind of nice rhythmical movement. If we don't want that rhythmical movement, that's fine. We don't have to have a ramp in the tremolo like I had it set. That depends on the waveform, and we can make it a lot subtler. So, as I said, that's really up to your own taste. Let's add what I've got here, which is a sidechain compressor idea as well to this track. This one you might be really very familiar with. Let's sidechain the, again, this meld sustained chord sound. Let's sidechain it to the kick pattern. Let's have it duck. So it's a little bit like tremolo, right? We're now kind of pulsing the synth sound up and down every time the kick hits. And if we change from the kick to say something like the hi-hat, perhaps, hear more pulsing. And if we made the hi-hat, for example, something like a 16th note pattern, then the chords can react to that sidechain. So it's another way we can get some movement, offbeat hi-hat pattern to the sidechain. And we're getting this kind of ducking a bit as the hi-hats play and the synth plays, right? And then if we add back in our tremolo, make that sidechain work a little bit better. If we wanted it there. right, so let's do a very quick recap. Danny boy, hi, thanks for the content you put out, usually watching your videos. Nice that I caught you live too. Danny boy, thank you very much for your comments. Great to have you with me today in today's live stream. The chat was pretty quiet. I was hoping everything has been functioning okay. So great to have you here, mates. Cheers to you as well for dropping a comment. So let's do a very quick recap here. And basically just look at the differences we've made. You know, the whole concept today was learn a bit about audio effects, programming them, tried to break down a little bit about what they can do, what they can bring to the table. Like a lot of things, I've just scratched the surface. This can go deeper, more advanced. I've tried to kind of give you some tips and tricks along the way. Start with very simple patterns and try to make those simple patterns with a simple synth sound or a simple drum sound become something completely new and completely different. And that's kind of like what happens here with the melody. If we switch off the processing, we reveal what we started with. No trickery in the synth, no sound design in the synth. It's all happening, the interest, from the effects. I showed another example, just plugging in a few notes, adding the same effects to it, same thing. Right, and then if we move to the bass line, similarly, it's just a very raw analog. The only difference being the envelope has been adjusted and I've moved the filter knob. But again, if we go to the effects and we reach for those, we've got a very vanilla sounding analog. It now gets a bit more depth to it, a bit more sound to it. I then showed you on the percussion track some examples here where we can really start to, you know, create a whole new almost melody from the sequence of this percussion track by adding these effects to it. And we looked at, this is corpus, this is resonator. Really great way to bring something new to your tracks. And then finally, I was just taking a look at this track that I set up called Sustained, which is just a default meld. And I've added this group of effects to it to again get it moving around, get it sounding a bit more interesting, right? So looking at the clock, I'm going to call that a wrap. I also think it's probably a good idea to save this project up in its current state. And perhaps, you know, it could be something we could revisit and take it to other levels and look into some of the other audio effects that I haven't touched on in today's stream. You know, some food for thought for another stream. But hopefully what I did touch on today gives you inspiration and ideas to go open up Ableton Live right now, fire it up and try some of these things out. Again, I've just been using Ableton Live's instruments and effects, and any samples were from the Suite packs. So you should be able to get your hands on those if you're a Suite user. Also used effects today that are 11, so I haven't done so much 12 focused. So hopefully that will help you guys and girls out using the 11. So I'm going to call that a wrap. I wish you a great rest of your Sunday, of course, and weekend. I will catch you in the next live stream. And if I ask a small favor, if you've got this far, enjoyed the video, found the content useful, beneficial, learnt a bunch of tips and tricks, fancy giving a thumbs up, drop us a comment, let us know your thoughts, subscribe, you know, ding the bell to receive a notification when the next video is online. I will link a video here at the end, which I'd recommend checking out. If you're into sound design, then go check out one of my previous ones, and I'm sure you'll learn a bunch more tips and tricks. Take care, have a great weekend, the rest of it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye for now.